Thank you for the kind introduction, sir. I appreciate the fact that you did not include the story about my being fired after my first day on the job in journalism. Well, sort of in journalism. I was hired as a copy editor at the M&M candy factory. And on that first day, I rejected about 50% of the production. Yeah. 86 to about half of the work that they did that day. I threw out all the W's and all the E's. Okay, I think I better go to work now. Here we go, folks. No more slapstick. I want to thank Renaissance and its program committee for the kind invitation to join you today. I live just a couple hundred yards from here, so I've been able to take advantage of the many Renaissance offerings over the years. Additionally, I want to thank Brett Davis for his technical assistance. I've been doing presentations like this since the late 1980s. Back then, the best technical teams were usually in the Las Vegas hotels, but now they've met their match with Brett. And I want to thank you for tuning in. Perhaps we are all suffering from a rash of Zoom fatigue. Consequently, I'll try to keep this relatively short, yet leave sufficient time for questions. What you're seeing now has been pre-recorded, so we won't be distracted by me going off on bizarre vectors. What that requires is for you to submit your comments on the chat mode of Zoom, which you can see here. Here's how to do that. Move your cursor to the bottom of your screen and left-click on the chat button. That will open a window on the right rail of your screen. You'll see the word everyone up at the top and the names of everyone who's participating in today's session. At the bottom of that window, you can type a message. If you have selected or clicked on everyone, the message or question goes to everyone. Or you can click on an individual's name and send a private message to him or her. If you want to submit a question, feel free to send it to everyone, or select my friend Senor Duncan, who is today's ringmaster. At the end of the session, he will select and repeat the questions, and I will take a shot at answering them. Duncan will also tell me when I'm talking too much. I'm going to try to do this with two 35 to 45-minute sessions. Then we'll switch to live chat for 10 plus minutes of Q&A, depending on how many questions you have. We will take a break for 11 minutes and 8 seconds before coming back online for round number 2. Finally, we should conclude with more time for Q&A. I promise to avoid spinning reporters' war stories. It's the task of my friend Duncan to pull the plug if I start down the road with tales of yore when stories were written on paper and sent back to the newsroom, stuck in a cleft stick. Does anyone remember Evelyn Waugh's character William Boot in the novel Scoop? Boot was sent out to Africa on a reporting trip, ill-prepared. As the critics would say, it's a rollicking send-up of journalists and journalism. It is a fun read if you can find it. In this first session, my focus will be roughly on U.S. journalism from World War II up until the year 2000, give or take a couple years. I'm not going to spend much time, if any, talking about the stories by, in, and about journalists or journalism. I think you as consumers of a certain age have a pretty good idea of those stories, both big and little. After our break, I shall pick up at roughly 20 years ago and review some of the major and again highly dynamic changing trends in all aspects of journalism. Everything from new skill sets and major changes in the daily activities of reporters, editors, and the entire newsroom to delivery mechanisms and consumer reactions. The answer to the question, "What did you do today, Mommy?" is far different from what it was when I broke into the business in the late 1960s. I shall also take a look at the declines in essentially all of the components of traditional journalism and conclude with a bit of a discussion of what can be done to save journalism, something that I believe is fundamental if we are to have a participatory, democratic society. I believe that democracy depends on informed citizens who should look to professional journalism for the data and analysis necessary to make fact-based, well-reasoned economic, social, and political decisions. Am I naive? Possibly. Am I alone? I don't think so, but perhaps you will disabuse me of such childish notions. Round two will conclude with what might be done to preserve professional journalism. Finally, we'll return for a second Q&A session, one that will run as long as you wish. All right, having laid out the timescape and agenda of our topic, let me mention about what I guess one might call my intellectual or philosophical vectors or perspectives into and within the topic of journalism in America. If we were to attempt to cover the entire history of printed journalism, that is, technologies used for reproductions, we'd have to start, or one of the places we could start is with the tipaio, or block printing, used by the Chinese emperors around 618. They were of limited distribution, sort of like the Hill, published today in Washington. Or we could zoom ahead to Gutenberg in the 1450s. We won't. That would require too much time. So as the earlier slide suggested, we shall narrow things down a bit and focus on, mostly, American journalism since World War II. That period of the war drove multiple changes in our lifetimes. Suddenly Americans were hearing, in real time, Murrow's broadcasts from London during the Blitz. They were going to the weekly movies, whose feature film was preceded by newsreels, sometimes only a week after the action. Consequently, technologies drove major changes in the production of news and, simultaneously, changes in the culture and consumption of news. So what do we see in the picture on the right? A shot of a newsroom taken at roughly the same time the war ended. First, there are women in the newsroom. That wasn't without precedent, but more women were hired during the war because the guys were serving elsewhere. Were they seen as equals and doing the same jobs or assignments as men? Not always. I broke into the newspaper business in 1969 at the Topeka, Kansas Capital Journal. We had one very good woman reporter who covered health, medicine, and science, but I can't remember women reporters or editors other than those in the women's department. They were producing cooking and social event stories and pages. And there were all women in the long, underappreciated category, librarians. That picture on the right was a basic view of what in our lifetimes was the old journalism. Ben Hecht and Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, even Lou Grant. So how can we study what was then and what is now? As you might have gathered by now, I'm a general systems guy. You will find I will often refer to variables or elements, and the connections are links directing the dynamic energies of change flowing via those linkages between the elements in any system. As we shall see, the media environment and its subset called journalism have changed in epic ways in our lifetime. Those changes continue. They continue at a rapid pace, but some fundamentals remain the same. In biology, we talk about the ecosphere or biosphere. It's that conceptual, but real, place housing all living species in their energy forms necessary to maintain their existence. That ecosphere is a dynamic environment because all living things are constantly taking in energy in a variety of forms: oxygen, carbon dioxide, sunlight, water, chemicals, etc. Those elements and forms are changed by metabolism. That, in turn, results in energy for movement, growth, reproduction, etc. In the discipline of communications, a similar concept describes a theoretical and real environment that is sometimes called the infosphere. I prefer datasphere for reasons I shall explain in a moment. Here, all humans, and in our case, journalists, take in data in a variety of forms. Everything from chemical elements to light rays and audio waves. We analyze that data by sight or touch or smell or recognized sound. That analysis results in information. Information, by definition, is that which assists us in making a decision, typically a decision to do something or not do something. It might be jerking our hand from a hot stove. It might be deciding to seek cover when we hear a tornado siren. It might be seeing the streetlight change and deciding to walk across the intersection. That data in, analysis, information out process applies constantly to all human activity, and in our special case, to journalists and journalism. As journalists, we take in data in a variety of forms, knowing that it'll be necessary to analyze the results. These forms are as old as a job application or description. Talking to people and taking notes of the conversations, consulting published schedules of ship arrivals, looking at election results. There is a long but little recognized precedent for this intellectual activity. Some of us argue that the first analytic journalist, or what today is sometimes called a data scientist, was that guy Moses. He was stuck in the desert but conducted not one but two censuses of the people in his tribe, and then analyzed that data to determine the size of his military resources. Daniel Defoe was perhaps the second recognized analytic journalist when he produced the Journal of the Plague Year. Defoe was looking at a variety of death records, noting the numbers and the location of the dead. Anyway, we take in data and analyze it using multiple methods depending on the data form. The results of that analysis generates information that, as journalists, we deliver to our customers and clients in multiple ways. We might deliver that information as text. We might deliver that information as in graphic forms and also illustrations. The same process generally applies to radio and television journalism. More about that generalized process in a moment. That said, here's where we start to see significant changes since roughly the 1990s, and changes with greater magnitude since the year 2000. For centuries, journalists took in necessary data existing in the infosphere of their times. They inhaled that data from standard, traditional ink-on-paper forms. That data was not easily replicated. That data's presence and location was usually, or at least often, in singular locations. The journalists had to go somewhere to connect with someone to be interviewed. Go to the police station and look at the arrest and booking records. Go to the fire while it was ablaze. Go to the parish for birth and death records. One of the few exceptions of the limitations of geographical presence would, in our time, be the federal publications sent through federal depository libraries, often at universities. But to see census data, that too required time to travel. To see the city or county budget, get thee to City Hall and hope to find a helpful clerk. But then, bam, along comes the digital age. Suddenly and dramatically, the infosphere becomes the datasphere. We still need the data from all the traditional sources and types, but. Now we're in a bits and bytes ecosphere, where suddenly not yet all, but a rapidly increasing amount of the necessary data resides. Somewhere out there, somewhere up there, in some invisible closet or warehouse or balloon, is the data we need. Just what in the hell is a server farm? What did I ever learn in school that allows me to see this data? Read this stuff. Help! Help! We're starting from scratch, trying to climb an invisible hill or even a mountain. That new data is ubiquitous. It's all around us, in every governmental, educational, corporate, and cultural institution. That new data is shareable, easily reproduced for essentially zero cost. I can make 100,000 copies of a digital book for the same unit price as one copy. And those digital documents, images, or recordings are scalable. I can literally take a picture of a postage stamp and blow it up to the size of a billboard. Yes, actually printing that billboard will have a cost of paper and canvas and ink, but devoid of the artist's labor, the actual expenditure falls dramatically. Librarians or compliance officers no longer have to think about feet or meters of shelf space for document storage. Administrators no longer have to consider how many copies of anything to produce. Just post a single file up in what has come to be called the cloud and let users, employees, citizens, journalists come and get it. The storage costs of that data? Forget it. Perhaps if there are some economic historians in the audience, they can provide some specifics, but I suspect that the speed and scale of change in the cost of digital data storage is unprecedented. Here we see that 5 megabytes of storage in 1956 cost $120,000. By the year 2005, a chip in the middle could hold 128 megabytes of data. And only 9 years later, a chip of the same size had the capacity of 128 gigabytes and cost $200. In the late 1980s, I recall paying $500 for a 20 megabyte hard drive. A couple of months ago, I bought a 2 terabyte USB flash drive for around $60. I just noticed that the price on these has declined to 2 of these drives for $35. The new digital data storage, however, opens greater opportunities for validation and analysis by multiple people, or in the case of government data, inspection by multiple citizens. Hence, proposals starting in the year 2008 began bubbling up for what is termed open data. Open data is a philosophy policy process whereby all government agencies post online the data government, at all levels, has been collecting and administering for ages. That data is posted by default because, after all, citizens have paid for it. It's the people's data, but that's a topic for another presentation. What this all meant is that those changes in the datasphere required new tools. As we shifted from atoms of ink and paper to electronic bits and bytes, we needed new tools and skills to find, identify, and retrieve that data. No matter what you may have learned in high school or college or graduate school, those skills were necessary but no longer sufficient. What you learned about writing a good and carefully edited essay or research paper, that still required those skills, but they no longer did the job as tools of analysis and storytelling. And all of that applied directly and specifically to the process of journalism. Secondly, technology is always far ahead and moving faster than the law and culture. Our National Freedom of Information Act is 50 years old, but what does it say about what portions of an arrest record should be stored and for how long? What do the HIPAA regulations saying about access to a nursing home's records of inspections? By whom, when, and how? Or what legislative committees should be broadcast using high-quality audio and video and posted online? How about government contracts with vendors and evaluation of the methods and performance of those vendors? What and how much of that vendor's methods to, say, manage a prison should fall under the protective category of intellectual property? And then we run into cultural barriers. Congress passed legislation in 2000 that permitted and accepted digital signatures on government documents. But until Alan Weber became mayor, the former city clerk and city attorney refused to recognize and accept such signatures. Consequently, only recently are you able to track city buses on Google Maps. Google didn't believe in ink on paper agreements, and the city wouldn't sign off on digital documents for 15 years. It is surely apparent, too, that the changes in data forms and formats drove or required changes in analytic tools and methods. All topical phenomena, or potential stories for a journalist, are composed of 4 primary variables. Data that is qualitative, quantitative, and geographic. And those factors are wrapped up in a timeline to measure and understand change in those variables. It then falls to the reporter to decide which of the data types, qualitative, quantitative, or geographic, offers the best potential to deliver interesting, meaningful, and potentially actionable information to our readers, listeners, and viewers. I would note that often the analytic tools are based on mathematical and statistical methods. That presented a special challenge to journalists because journalism is often the second place of refuge for the mathematically phobic, the first refuge being found in studying modern dance, and even that requires counting rhythm. I have literally seen American journalists physically recoil when I tell them, now we're going to do some arithmetic. And I'm only talking about some basics of measuring proportion, things that they learned in the 7th or 8th grade. So having harvested and analyzed the story-relevant data, what are the best ways to deliver this information? Heretofore, that was a question with limited alternatives. A newspaper or magazine reporter wrote the story and it was published. A broadcast reporter wrote and read the story and it was passed along the broadcasting frequencies, 81.5 on your FM dial or Channel 4 on the TV. Today, it's not so easy. The same story needs to be and will be delivered via multiple methods and platforms. You have your ink on paper. You have your traditional radio and television, your Twitter and other social media platforms, your blogs, your podcasts, your newsletters and email lists, your institutional and personal websites. What then are the implications of that reality? First, no individual in any profession can know everything about all of the increasingly sophisticated tools necessary to function in the data sphere. Can a good interviewer or skilled writer find and clean a government data set? Maybe, but only to a limited degree, because new computer languages and applications are literally changing weekly. What that reporter knew how to do last month has changed, so how does she continually update her skills? And is doing so the best use of her time? It's a challenge for the journalist, for the editor, for the institution, all trying to manage their resources of time and money. That means that the days of the Lone Ranger reporter, one who ventured out onto the savannah armed only with a notebook and a pencil to slay the lions of corruption and justice, that can no longer harvest the trophy. A team of individuals is required. Each of them needs to have an understanding of the fundamentals of journalism, its objectives, ethics, and storytelling narratives, but then they need to know their specialties in depth. How to leverage geographic data with demographic data by using geoinformation systems or science to literally see changes over time and space. How do you integrate archival and novel videos into the textual aspects and delivery? How do we deliver statistical analysis as more than tables of numbers, but also as charts and graphs, dynamic charts and graphs at that? Because all data is dirty, at least initially is dirty, a team member needs to know how to use regular expressions to make sure that an address in a data set is always going to be spelled F-I-R-S-T Street, and not one with the ST suffix. That team member will also need to know coding shortcuts in Python or Ruby or Rust or JavaScript to ultimately let readers query the data pertaining to their nation, state, city, or zip code. Those factors of change require new tools of collaboration. Digital applications that allow team members working literally around the world to communicate with each other, often in real time, while reaching across huge time zone differences. In the aggregate, all of these things require new management perspectives. 20 or 25 years ago, managing by walking around was in vogue. A manager in any business, and especially in newsrooms, was encouraged to literally walk around and talk with their staff. He or she wanted to get early and immediate tip-offs to problems coming down the line with Project X or Y, or a sense of who was working on what and did they need help. Today, especially in recent times of pandemics and a widely dispersed workforce, what is considered management best practice, and how do we measure those? All of this lays out some of the dynamic factors of change in the data sphere, variables almost mandating the rise of what I prefer to call analytic journalism, but the term data journalist has taken over in the past 4 or 5 years. Why? Because data has fewer letters than analytic. Journalists and especially editors like to keep things short. I shall skip spinning yarns about Moses and Daniel Defoe and briefly focus on what has happened in our lifetimes, at least if you were born before the Eisenhower-Stevenson presidential election. Each of these milestones are worth a lecture in themselves. The first example of what was long called computer-assisted reporting was in that election when CBS used a UNIVAC computer to project Ike's win. If we were meeting face to face, I would have brought along one of these as a souvenir. What the price we pay for dealing with pandemics. But let's take a look at what seems to be the first time digital tools, those old punch cards and sorting bins, were used to combine social science methods and journalism. It was on election night, 1952.
Good evening, everyone. This is Walter Cronkite speaking to you from CBS Television Election Headquarters here in New York City.
Election night, 1952. Television news was still in its infancy, and so was computer technology. But on that night, the two came together, here on CBS.
This is the face of a UNIVAC. A UNIVAC is a fabulous electronic machine which we have borrowed to help us predict this election from the basis of the early returns as they come in.
The UNIVAC was one of the world's first commercial computers, and on this night, it was also the first time most Americans saw a computer at work.
This is not a joke or a trick. It's an experiment. We think it's going to work.
CBS News correspondent Charles Collingwood sat beside a mock-up of the UNIVAC, while the real computer was at work about 100 miles away in Philadelphia. At first, things didn't go so smoothly.
Can you say something, UNIVAC? Have you got anything to say to the television audience? You're a very impolite machine, I must say.
And even when the computer did make a prediction, the programmers held it back. Despite polls indicating a tight race between Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower and Democrat Adlai Stevenson, UNIVAC saw a landslide victory for Eisenhower. After midnight, a representative from the company that owned the computer explained the hesitation.
Came in. The odds came back, and it was obviously evident that we should have had nerve enough to believe the machine in the first place. It was right. We were wrong. Next year, we'll believe it.
4 years later, UNIVAC returned to CBS's election night coverage and again made the right call.
With 1,304,200 votes reported, UNIVAC predicts now, with again odds of 100 to 1, that Eisenhower will be re-elected president.
So there was a toehold on the beachhead of data analysis used by journalists in 1952. But changing perspectives and methods can be hard, difficult, long, and expensive. Because of cost and lack of skills, and maybe lack of insight, the next significant reporting enhanced by digital tools didn't come until the late 1960s. Then night-ridder reporters like my friend Phil Meyer and a bit later Clarence Jones brought a new sensibility to their newsrooms. Phil, having studied social science methods while on a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, surveyed and analyzed participants in the Detroit riots in 1967. Meyer found, unlike the common bleating of politicians, that the rioters were not outsiders coming to cause trouble in the Motor City. Also, that those arrested in the riots were as likely to have attended college as they were to have been high school dropouts. Those types of insights cannot be done just by talking to people on the street or in jail or to arresting officers. In a similar fashion, and a year later, Clarence Jones at the Miami Herald collected and punched holes in hundreds of those Hollerith cards to analyze 682 cases from 1 year in the Dade County criminal justice system. Those 13,000 key punch cards uncovered bias in the Dade County criminal justice system. The analysis, titled A Scientific Look at Dade Crime, turned out to be the first journalistic use of computers to analyze government records. So the data sphere was changing. At roughly the same time Meyer and Jones were doing their innovative work, a new online text service called Dialogue digitized Ohio's state laws and made access to the statutes via computer terminal. Today that service has evolved into LexisNexis. While the data was helpful and important, those terminals drove cultural change in the newsrooms. It was the librarians, now termed news researchers, who quickly saw the utility of real-time digital searching that required learning how to swim in digital seas of logic and consistent methodologies. It was the librarians then, all of whom deserve canonization, who were the first to bring the digital revolution into journalism. In those early years, we used to call it computer-assisted reporting, a term that was a catalyst for many jokes like, should we have called it telephone-assisted reporting? Eventually, but slowly, dedicated terminals and newsrooms were replaced by personal computers, but the hardware and software costs were high. When I went to work as deputy editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1997, we had one newsroom PC for a staff of approximately 130. That was the only way we were able to connect to the internet, that one PC. We set out to upgrade the system with dedicated PCs and network software for the entire newsroom. The best solution, in my opinion, would have cost between $5 and $6 million, a big chunk of change even for a successful newspaper the size of the Post-Dispatch. But earlier in the 1990s, there was a big change that heightened the awareness of data-driven journalism. That came when another friend and colleague, Steve Doig, who was then at the Miami Herald, used a mainframe and PCs to analyze data, qualitative, quantitative, and geographic, related to the impact of Hurricane Andrew on Miami and the Miami South Florida region. Doig and his colleagues collected fine-grained weather data that tracked the path of the hurricane as it hit Miami and the Homestead Air Force Base just south of the city. Fortunately, that area is loaded with wind speed and I think barometric pressure sensors on 1 square mile grids throughout the area. When the hurricane had passed, various agencies assessed and recorded in good detail damage to the region. Finally, turning to the city's archive of building inspectors' permits and construction reports, Doig and his team were able to sort out which properties had been hit and had been inspected by which individuals. The team, after having done some initial on-the-ground reporting, came up with a hypothesis. Older buildings, and especially homes, were likely to have suffered greater damage because of insufficient building materials and antiquated methods. Among the datasets were numbers indicating wind speeds up to 160 plus miles per hour that hit both the city and then down to the south toward the Air Force Base. They analyzed the years of home construction and related building permit compliances. Were the proper materials and methods used depending on the codes of the times? They also correlated the date of construction with damage from the hurricane. And they mapped the location of 15,000 homes declared uninhabitable. Those data sets clearly showed that there were concentrated areas of damage, usually zones that received high and concentrated winds. And when the team turns to studying all of these variables, along with construction permits and inspection sign-offs, some interesting trends appeared. What the team discovered was that the newer homes suffered greater damage than the older homes. Hypothesis disproved. Why? Basically crooked building inspectors. One reporter later wrote, contractors cut corners as the storm dragged on, and instead of using sturdier plywood under roofs, they used a cheaper, flimsier version of particle board. Instead of using roofing nails, they used staples. And if every roof rafter should have had a metal tie-down, as the codes indicated, the contractors should have used those tie-downs nailed into each truss, which today cost $1.50. The contractor could have saved money by using them on every other rafter. Or better yet, why use them at all? Just nail the rafter into the header plate and the wall frame. We don't need no stinking tie-downs, and $20 to a building inspector saves time and money. So, to cut to the chase. What happened? Convictions and jail time for bribe-taking building inspectors. Governments at all levels and throughout the state seriously examined their inspection policies and processes, and in many cases they dramatically rewrote building codes. Of course, within a couple of years, the contractors started whining about how restrictive and costly were those changes, many of which were softened in later years. And Doig and the team picked up a Pulitzer Prize for public service reporting. Yes, things do change. For the first time, and in a major way everyone in journalism could see and perhaps understand, the data in, analysis, information out schema had significant applications that perhaps even the journalists could use. Yes, the Miami Herald was a big and at the time an extraordinarily rich paper. The newsroom on the banks of Biscayne Bay could afford to assign, for starters, 2 or 3 reporters and a couple interns to a project. But journalists could also see that the Hurricane Andrew reporting was a scalable project. Yes, Miami had used some mainframe computers and PCs and programming, but a lot of it was done on those desktop PCs. Remember, this was 1992. Personal computers had been around since the early 80s, at least 15 years. Maybe, just maybe, there was some geek or nerd in our newsroom who could do some of this data retrieval, data cleaning, analysis, and semi-digital publishing. Reporters, rarely well paid, began lobbying their spouses about the absolute necessity to buy a home computer, printer, and appropriate software. Word processors like WordStar, which is still my favorite, or WordPerfect, and packages like 123 for elementary data analysis. With that recognition came the realization that the changes weren't transitory after all. Our professional organizations began to change. By 1990, annual meetings of the Investigative Reporters and Editors and the Newspaper Publishers Association began to include sessions taught by working journalists, news librarians, and journalism professors like me began to teach online searching in the pre-Google days. We taught spreadsheet basics using Excel. And in 1997, I introduced Esri's GIS applications to the IRE, which began offering week-long boot camp training. Okay, it's a reporter's story, but give me a break, will you? It's only one sentence. Originally, these classes were taught by journalists who had learned something about computing. In the mid-1990s, an IRE or sister organization emerged, NICAR, or the National Institute of Computer-Assisted Reporting. NICAR held its own national and increasingly international conferences focusing on digital techniques and applications. Again, these were taught by journalists, but by the early to mid-2000s, more younger and female individuals started showing up who were trained in computer science. But more about that in the next session. To summarize, the years from World War II until roughly 2000 experienced dramatic and sweeping changes in the information and data ecosystems. Those dynamic environmental changes were the catalysts in the overall process of producing stories, which in turn meant that journalists not only needed to practice and polish their writing and photography, they needed to spend more time in continuous education. Media companies also needed to invest in their employee training, something that all too few were willing to finance. Lastly, the audiences for journalism also changed. Their expectations shifted, their news consumption patterns shifted, their willingness to pay for journalism, especially print journalism, disappeared along with advertisers' confidence in their media buys. Okay, let's see how successful I've been in confusing you. Mr. Duncan, our first question, comment, observation, please.